All right, perfect. So we are about to hop back in. Let me share my screen and I will pass it over to Dr. Naya Blair Hackworth.
Thanks, Sade, and thanks everyone for being here today through our ADID virtual connections here in November. My name is Dr. Naya Blair Hackworth. My pronouns are she and her, and I serve as one of the directors in the Office of Inclusion. I had the wonderful opportunity to help lead our ADID efforts. We have some exciting news to share with you all today. As you, hopefully some of you wind down or exhale a little bit ago with talking with other colleagues in ADIDs. We have our educational modules that are up and live. We are really excited. We have the first two modules available for you all in the learning portal. The first one's on understanding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The second one is on identities, intersectionality, and belonging. These modules are no more than 5 to 7 minutes. They're quick snapshots to help give you some baseline information about DEIB. We know that ADIDs have come into this designation with different levels of experience in the DEIB space. And so we wanted to first start out with some foundational educational information about DEIB. We will have additional modules throughout next year that will be in the modules that will be in the learning portal. But again, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to go to the learning portal. If you just type in ADIDs, you will see those available. We're going to hopefully make it also available to others who are not ADIDs as well. But this is just great. And you can utilize this information to have conversations with your other colleagues, with student athletes, and again, for your own knowledge. So we're really excited about this. We have more modules in the works. We are also open if you have specific areas that you want us to create modules about, please let us know. You can even put that in the chat right now. Like, hey, Naya, we would love to have a module on XYZ. We will work to add that to our list. So again, the ADID educational modules are now in the learning portal if you just type in ADID. So I'll pause. I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any questions or comments about that, but feel free to put them in the chat if you have any questions or if you have any ideas about other modules that we should look to create. So hearing none and seeing nothing in the chat thus far, I want to also talk about the D1 ADID legislation that will be enacted in August of 2025. If you're not aware, Division 1 states that in next August, the ADIDs will be an active member of an institution. Again, shall designate a senior level administrator. This is very different than what it currently states now. ADIDs must be a senior level administrator with appropriate training as the athletics diversity inclusion designee. Appropriate training is to be defined by your institution. But the ADID at Division 1 primary responsibility shall include initiatives related to the institution's obligation to create environments and an atmosphere of respect for and sensitivity to the dignity of every person as required by the NCAA Constitution. So it's important, one, for you to know this. We're going to be sharing this information as an association more and more as we get closer to that legislative date, which is August 1st of 2025. But we want you to be aware of that. Part of us creating the modules, one, is because we want to continue to provide education for you all, regardless of what division you are in, and also to make sure to have some things for those Division 1 ADIDs when you're looking at training opportunities. We are not saying that our modules are the appropriate training that you have to have. That is something that you have to define within your institution, but we do want to let you know about this, and we'll talk more about the D1 legislation at our next Community Connections call, which will be division specific. So I'll pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions or comments about this legislation before we move forward.
I just had a quick question. How is the NCAA defining a senior level administrator?
The NCAA is not defining that.
Oh.
Your institution is defining that. So that is one of the questions that came up. So good question. So just based off of each institution. And it's important to note that right now, this is very institution specific and not conference specific in terms of the ADID being a senior level administrator with appropriate training. Brenda asked a good question many times. This eventually trickles down to D2 and D3. Is it expected for this as well? Our colleagues in Division 2 and Division 3 definitely know about the legislation. As of right now, it has not, but this would be a great opportunity for you to engage with your governance colleagues or your colleagues who are in management council to see what type of conversations that are taking place regarding this. And we also recognize just in general that in the Division 2 and Division 3, there are different challenges that could be associated with making this legislation happen. Again, I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it's not happened yet. Any other questions or comments? Now we'll move to the last portion of my time today, is NCORE connections. So if you're familiar with NCORE, please put like an exclamation point in the chat. NCORE is a national conference on race and ethnicity. And the NCAA, Inclusion, Education, and Community Engagement, our department, our unit in partnership with NCORE. We have this partnership that we've had for the past few years. But as a part of this partnership, we did this last year and we're doing this year, is that we'll be providing complimentary access to ADIDs to be a part of NCORE Connections. And this is their fall online conference that took place last week. And this is an opportunity for you all to gain additional information and experience and knowledge in the DEIB space. And you'd have access to these modules from now until next June, I believe. We are providing 150 ADIDs with access codes. So if you would like access to this, Sade has put the form in the chat. It's also was in the email that was sent to you all about community connections and some other things that are coming up. So this again is a great opportunity to look at engaging in your own time, learning about different topics from our colleagues from the NCORE conference. In addition, I want to share that the NCORE conference this year will take place next May, in New York City. And within NCORE, they have different committees. And one of the committees is the committee with athletics in the community. That's what it's called, And that committee, we look at to see how can we engage athletics in the conversation on race and ethnicity and the other topics that NCORE provides. And so one of the ways we do that is submitting proposals. And so I'm going to put another link in the chat. If you are interested in partnering with someone at your institution or across institutions, or just submitting a proposal yourself, please do. This is an opportunity to highlight different things that you're doing within athletics from a DEI lens, some of the challenges, cross-culture or cross-campus collaboration is possible as well to submit a proposal. These proposals, and it's open until December the 13th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But the different committees, again, the athletics and the academy committee, will be looking at proposals. So again, we can't guarantee that yours will be selected. Well, we can say, hey, you have a fair shot if you apply, right? Because you have people, you have peers within athletics that will be reviewing applications. And so it's a really great opportunity. So again, I encourage you to either sign up for the NCORE Connections, and considering to submit a proposal for a conference here at NCORE. With that being said, I'll turn it back over to you, Sade, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Naya, for all of that great information. I do want to emphasize, please utilize that form to sign up for Encore Connections within the email that you received, within the form, and also on the ADID webpage. There are detailed instructions on how to successfully register for the virtual conference. So I encourage you all to utilize that. But as always, if you have any questions or if you're having any challenges completing that registration, please feel free to reach out to us. All right, now the moment that I have absolutely been waiting for because I am so excited to have our guest here, Betsy Butterick, aka the Coach's Coach. She did a phenomenal job at our inclusion forum and got raving reviews on her session from both administrators, coaches, and student athletes alike. We even asked our student athletes, like, what part of the symposium did you enjoy the most? And they were like, Betsy. And I'm like, she wasn't even in it. So that just shows you how great she was and how much of an impact that she had. But Betsy, aka the Coach's Coach, is a seasoned pro who utilizes the transformative power of communication to help build high performing teams. As a former coach, Betsy understands that chemistry is more than a buzzword, it is the result of genuine connection, and at its core lies effective communication. In her role as the coach's coach, Betsy meets individuals where they are and supports their growth and evolution. As a communication specialist, she works collaboratively to enhance communication effectiveness and drive positive change at every level. Betsy has the exceptional ability to connect with diverse audiences, and as a facilitator and educator, she offers a professional, playful, and people centric approach to learning and development. A lifelong athlete, Betsy grew up playing all sports and was a competitive basketball player and at the collegiate level. She now spends her time with her family, hiking, biking, practicing yoga, chasing sunsets, and in constant pursuit of the perfect breakfast burrito. I will stop sharing my screen and allow Betsy to come on and take it away.
Thank you so much, Sade, and thank you everyone for taking time to be on today's call. I have immense gratitude for the work that you are all doing individually, collectively, within your role or position, yes, but also within your community. And listening to the conversation so far, I want to emphasize that feeling of tiredness, physically feeling tired, but also emotionally feeling tired, and continuing to show up and do the work feels more challenging than it has in recent history. And so just your presence here, I hold with so much gratitude and appreciation. And yeah, I find myself moving differently in these times, which is also a different experience. Um, I've got two daughters, and we're fast tracking my adoption of them because even though they have my last name and I'm on their birth certificate, we live in North Carolina, and there's uncertainty around the future for families that look like mine. So, the way that you all champion diversity and understanding, thank you for doing what you do. I heard Wind Down Wednesday, and I really thought it was Wine Down Wednesday, and I'm also here for that. So if that fits with anyone, I feel you. And I want to give a shout out, some familiar faces, Dr. Amy Wilson, Brenda, Monique, Harold. It's great to see you all. If I've missed anyone that I've communicated with previously, hello again. And thank you for the opportunity to share when we talk about diversity, we talk about understanding. A lot of my work over the past several years has been focused on helping coaches better understand kids these days and why kids these days are showing up differently. So, as an opening exercise, what I would like to do is I'd like to have you all fill in whatever is true for you in response to the prompt kids these days. So, kids these days, blank. Whatever is true in your experience, if you wouldn't mind dropping that into the chat, we'll kick off in that way. What have you noticed about kids these days? Okay, so kids these days are overly stressed, constantly changing, struggle with resilience, in touch with sharing their thoughts when they feel safe, but safe seems less so in larger groups, transparent, don't read their emails, or maybe that's everyone, struggling. Yes, all of these are true. Willing but need extra guidance, use slang that doesn't make sense. Yeah, stigma. Super open, sometimes hard to find, overly worked, and no using proper outlets to express frustration. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I'll say that when I say a lot of the work that I do is around replacing judgment with understanding, that's what we're here to explore today. And when I did this session at the NCAA Inclusion Forum, I had 45 minutes, which is about the same time I have now. Full transparency, the run of this session is about 90 minutes, and I have a separate 90-minute session that builds upon this original work. So I won't have time today to go through everything that you're going to see on the screen, but my goal is to touch on some of the more salient points to give you an understanding of how you might support, whether it's coaches or educators. And I do have an educator, non-athlete specific version of this session, so that we are doing what we can control to facilitate our ability to better connect with young people today. Because when we reach them, then we can teach them. And a lot of the things that you all said were very kind in comparison to what I've heard from coaches across the country when they talk about some of their frustrations with kids these days. So when we talk about Gen Z and coming up behind them, Gen Alpha, to ground us in a shared understanding, we're talking about individuals born during or after 95, 96. And the unique hallmark of this generation is that they've never known life without the internet. And you could say, okay, Betsy, I understand the internet was somewhat revolutionary. It's a big deal. And yet, if we look at a more granular perspective, that's going to help shape our understanding. So I'm 41 years old. I was born in 1983. I'm what's known as an elder millennial. We are very wise. We're also very humble. And in my lifetime alone, the changes in technology have been incredible. I think about when I was a kid, I grew up in a house that had one phone and it lived in the kitchen and had that long spiral cord that you could stretch and get like 3 rooms of bandwidth. And at that time, most of my friends didn't have answering machines. So if you called, the phone would ring and ring and ring. And if nobody picked up, then you hung up and you did this thing called waiting, which also seems to be a lost art for many of us, not just Gen Z. I think about the fact that if I wanted to know something, I had to go to this place called the library and use a tiny golf pencil and something called the Dewey Decimal System to look up the location of a book that hopefully had the information that I wanted to know, or ask someone that was older and presumably wiser than me. I think about the fact, and this does pain me, kids these days will never know the devotion that it took to make a mixtape. And I can see with perfect clarity my yellow Casio radio cassette combo player and like waiting for the hot 9 to come on and hitting record at exactly the right moment and then stop and then leaving a little dead space. I think about the fact that we had a computer lab in school, but we only used it for one of two things. One was word processing, so we'd practice our typing and it would print out on these long reams of paper that folded like an accordion with the perforated edges. We were absolutely not going green at that time. And then the other thing we used the computer lab for was to play what I still think is one of the best games in the history of games, which is, of course, the end of the Oregon Trail. And it was black and green, very rudimentary. I almost always forded the river, and it was rarely the right decision, but that was part of how we learned. Even as I got older, I remember the first car phone, it was like they took the kitchen phone out of the kitchen and just stuck it between the passenger and driver seats. It was huge. And at one point I had a pager, and then I had a cell phone in high school, but the only thing you could really do with it at the time was call home. And now I look at my phone and it unlocks with something called Face ID. So in my lifetime alone, the changes in technology have been incredible. So to say that Gen Z has never known life without the internet, this is a really big deal. And what we're going to explore today is the way that their relationship with technology has also influenced the way that they're showing up specifically in the athletic space, but also just more generally as well. So when I ask coaches specifically to fill in that phrase kids these days, what I often hear are more complaints than compliments, more frustrations than, let's say, reasons for celebration. Short attention spans, so much texting, even if they're sitting next to each other, they're in the same room, they're texting each other. It's like they can't accept criticism, even if it's constructive. There's this reason why it's not their fault or somebody else is to blame. And there's this constant need for reassurance and validation, even for things that arguably are just part of what they should do, and they don't need the pat on the back from older generations' perspective. So when we talk about kids these days, if we can understand more the context of the world in which they grew up, we're much more better suited to replace some of the judgments with understanding. And when we do so, better connect with them so that we can coach them, so that we can educate them, so we can prepare them for ways that we know life is going to challenge them. So here's what some of the experts say, and I'll say transparently, in my role as a facilitator and public speaker, one of the cardinal rules is never put a lot of text on the screen. Because when you put a lot of text on the screen, the audience will start reading and they'll stop listening to what you're going to say. When I was growing up, I loved those choose your own adventure books where at some point you had to make a decision and then you turned to a different page and either the story continued or it ended, usually with your own peril. So the choice is yours. In a moment, there's going to be a lot of text on the screen. You can listen to what I say or you can read, completely up to you. So when we talk about the research, what we know is that studies show constant exposure to screens from an early age has changed the neural circuitry of developing brains. And this has resulted in shorter attention spans and stunted social skills and a heightened need to multitask. In addition, research suggests that their brains have evolved to process information at faster speeds, but getting and holding their attention can be a challenge. And then finally, if you look at the popular apps, you'll see that we're raising a generation of highly visual communicators. This is absolutely something that we can lean into as educators and support people. So when it comes to Gen Z, a few other fun facts. 52% cite honesty as the most important quality in leadership. Now, when we put it into context that Gen Z was raised in a post 9/11 world, and you see on the screen an era of school shootings, global terrorism, recession, climate change, as a result, Gen Z has been much more realistic than optimistic. And this isn't to say that they're pessimistic. It's to say that because of technology, they've had greater access to information about what's true than previous generations. Now, we could put information in air quotes because I also read a study that said 86% of Gen Z cites TikTok as a reputable source of information. I myself have learned some incredible life hacks from TikTok, and we're just going to leave the validity of the information for a separate conversation. Additionally, 61% desire a career in social entrepreneurship. So we often see Gen Z interfacing with something like their phone or a piece of technology, and we think of this as an autonomous relationship. But that piece of technology has connected them to a global community from a very early age. And so they have this not just desire, but almost a need to contribute their original ideas to a larger collective. And then the scary one is 79% of Gen Z displays symptoms of emotional distress when kept from their electronic devices. When I first read that stat at the bottom of the screen, Gen Z routinely multitasks across 5 screens, I thought, how? That's too many screens. Like, how is that possible? But if we take a typical student, even a student athlete, and we put them in a context like, let's say their dorm room, they probably have their cell phone nearby. Maybe they've got a tablet that they took notes on during class. They're working on a presentation on their laptop. They've got the TV on in the background. And let's say they've got a wearable. So that's 5. 5 screens. Very typical for today's young people, very atypical for previous generations. When we're talking about some of the high-level differences that we're seeing in our youngest generation, this is what comes to mind. We're seeing shorter attention spans and stunted social skills. Now, when I say stunted, it can sound like a jab. It's not meant to be. It's simply an acknowledgement that because of technology, Gen Z hasn't had the same opportunities as previous generations to practice things like face-to-face communication. So in that way, because of less reps, those social skills are a little more stunted or underdeveloped. Additionally, they skim read and digest bite-sized amounts of information at incredible rates. They're visual communicators and accustomed to chat-based forms of communication. Now, when you hear chat-based, it's very easy to think texting. I want you to expand that out to mean short exchanges of information or communication, even when it's face-to-face. Highly educated, industrious, and collaborative. Again, thank you, Internet. More realistic than optimistic. They value honesty and leadership. They are data-driven and accustomed to instant expert feedback. And this is the scary part, because in large part of social media, Gen Z has been conditioned over time to disproportionately value the opinions of others. And this is something that we experience in a variety of contexts. Even when, let's say, you ask a group of young people a question, and you know maybe several of those members know the answer, but nobody speaks. It's often because they're worried about how they will be judged by their peers if they enter into that space. Okay, super fun. There's a lot of challenges, and what comes next, specifically in an athletic context, and I know not all of you work primarily with athletics, so if athletics isn't your home base, I'm going to invite you to make the translation of how does this challenge fit, and how do some of the tools that I talk about, what's the adaptation of those tools in order to meet the needs that you experience in your space. And I'll say, as we go along, if a question comes up for you, please go ahead and drop it in the chat. Sade, if you could help direct my attention to the chat when necessary. For the interest of time, I'm going to keep going unless I know that there's something that's pertinent to answer as we go along. I'll say too, before we dive in, two things that come to mind. Anything that you personally or that you observe others in your space frustrated with when it comes to today's young people, I want to invite you to think it's not impossible. It's simply unpracticed. Again, they haven't had, because of technology, the same opportunities as older generations to practice certain skills. So the invitation becomes, how can we as educators create opportunities for them to start to rep some of those skills? The other thing I'll say before we dive in is there's often a misconception that what's being asked of us when it comes to Gen Z, Gen Alpha, is to be more gentle with them, to be soft on them. And I love that reel that was going around on social media with the millennial mom and the boomer grandma, and the grandma's interacting with the kid, and every time she interacts, the mom is exhibiting gentle parenting, and the grandma will say like, "Oh, good job," and the mom's like, "No, good choice," and she's like, "Thank you," and she's like, "No, say good choice," and it ends with playing on the playground, and the grandma says, "Oh, be careful," and the mom's like, "No, do you feel safe?" And the grandma's like, "I don't feel safe with any of this." Okay, all to say, the ask here is not to be softer on kids these days. It's not to lower the bar or your standards or expectations. It's to understand that if we hope for them to meet or exceed those standards or expectations, because the world they've grown up in is very different from ours, we first need to be able to connect with them where they are, so we stand a chance at teaching them some of the things that we know they're going to need to learn to be successful outside of our time together. And that's what this is really about. So our first challenge as we move forward is 8 seconds. This is roughly the attention span of Gen Z. By a show of hands, those of you that have your cameras on, any Ted Lasso fans out there? Okay, in season 1 of Ted Lasso, Ted tells Sam, one of the players, to be like a goldfish. In the chat, what do you think is the attention span of a goldfish? What have you heard? Okay, I see 5 seconds. Any other guesses for the goldfish? 10 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Okay, lots of votes for 5. No attention. Yeah. Transparently, I have not interviewed the goldfish recently, and I don't want to misrepresent, but we're roughly talking about the same attention span of a goldfish with today's young people. So the next time you look at a group of students, if you think about a giant bowl of goldfish, that's what we're working with in terms of attention. The good news is there's a lot we can do. So our challenge is, how do we communicate in short bursts while making our communication visual at every opportunity? And again, I'm not going to go through each bullet point that comes up here, but I do want to give you some of the more salient points. So I'll pull them up here first, and then we can talk about just a few of them as we go on. Oops. Sorry, we skipped ahead here because I clicked the wrong portion. Give me 1 sec. Okay. So when it comes to 8 seconds, and I'll pull all of these up and we'll just touch on a few here. All right. Ping-ponging speakers. The idea here is when we change speaker, we re-engage attention. So gone are the days where I, even as a coach, could stand, let's say, on the baseline. In my background in coaching, I coached for 10 years collegiately as in women's basketball. Gone are the days where I could stand on the baseline and talk at my team for even as little as 2 minutes and hold their attention, regardless of how skilled I might be as a speaker or use different, engagement methods with tonality or timing. I'm much better served now to explain a portion of what I want them to understand and then kick it to another coach. They explain a piece and then they kick it back to me. If you're interfacing, let's say, with just one individual, changing speakers can look like giving them an opportunity to speak. So interjecting questions, whether we call that the Socratic method, and Socrates was famous for questioning his pupils into greater understanding and knowledge, or lean into elements like motivational interviewing. This is a highly effective way to not only engage the attention of young people, but also to increase learning and retention. When they're involved in their experience, the learning is cemented at a different level. The coaching example I often give is every coach I've ever known across sport is always pressed for time. And so it's much more expedient across sport to tell than it is to ask. And yet a different level of learning happens when we ask instead of tell. An example would be if my team, let's say, is scrimmaging. Very common practice at some point when I see something that's off, for a coach to blow a whistle and say, let's say to a defensive player, hey, when the ball's there, you need to be there. Completely different experience if in that same context I blow the whistle and then I say, hey, when the ball's there, where do you need to be? Even though I'm talking to one individual who's out of position, Everybody else in the gym at that time, even the players on offense, are now thinking about how they would respond if they were asked that question. So when we ask, we get a different level of engagement, and we also create an opportunity for a deeper level of learning. When it comes to a few of these that you see here, anytime we can create pictures, and I often ask coaches specifically, what's the most important information you want your team to know or understand? And then the follow-up question is, okay, now how do you make that visual? If we can provide some sort of visual, and sometimes it's a physical picture or representation, sometimes it's using language to do that, using language to create visual images, or using things like analogies or metaphors to allow them to create a visual in their mind. This is kind of like this. When we can give them a picture for it, it engages them in a different way. And then using technology. Again, this sounds simple, but even in 2015, which was the last year that I coached a college season, as coaches, when we came down to the gym, the first thing we did was put our phones away because we're coaching. We don't need our phones. Most of us have on our person or in near proximity one of the more effective teaching tools for working with today's athletes. So I'm better served to maybe film a short 5-second clip even, and then when that player comes out of a drill, say, hey, I want you to watch something for a second, and then show them the clip. Instead of just watching them and telling them what to look for, I might also say, I'm going to show you something that I just saw, and I want you to watch your feet. Tell me what you see. So there's different ways that we can also use technology to engage their attention, but also increase their learning as well. All right, the next challenge, skim read. Gen Z consumes bite-sized chunks of information at incredible rates. It's a common practice if a member of Gen Z Googles something, instantaneously millions of search results are going to come up. They're going to start to skim, and when they find one of interest, they'll click on it, and they're going to start to skim again. If they don't find what they're looking for in approximately 6 seconds, they will back out and go down to the next source. So this is a highly practiced skill. Our challenge, especially in communication, is how do we stick to facts and stats and summaries and key points, especially in written communication? A few things that we can do. Bullet points, and it sounds super simple. It is, and yet it's highly effective. Just changing the structure of the written word. If I were to send a group of athletes, let's say, I split my team in half. Half the team gets an email from me that has 1 paragraph, 5 sentences. The other half of the team gets those saved 5 sentences, but instead of paragraph form, it's broken out into 5 bullet points. The next day at practice, the bullet point group would be able to tell me more specifically the content of that communication. And all I've done is change the structure. So structure matters. Lists are great. Top 3, top 5, top 10. Infographics. If you're not already using Canva, C-A-N-V-A, I highly recommend using Canva, in part because there's a free version and it's populated with so many different infographics that can lend a visual support to the information we're looking to communicate. Prioritizing information. So the most recent or most relevant, let's put it on top. Who can tell me in the chat what the acronym TLDR stands for? Who knows what TLDR stands for? Let's see who knows. Too long, didn't read. Very good. Okay, so it's not just Gen Z. We also have acronyms for our own attention spans. Anytime I see TLDR, it begs the question in my mind, why didn't we just start with that and then put, the details below? So if we know that they're likely to skim, how do we prioritize the most important information? Additionally, the haiku test, and this is one of my favorites. I'm not saying it's you, but most of us know somebody who tends to be a little long-winded. If that is you or someone you know, a great way to work on being more concise and brief is to do what I call the haiku test. And a haiku is a Japanese form of poetry with a very specific structure. So 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. If you can put what you're looking to communicate in the context of a haiku, you're likely communicating not only within attention span, but in a very clear and concise manner. An example I like to give is Generation Z, 5 syllables, likes information that is 7 syllables, short and to the point. Generation Z likes information that is short and to the point. So if you're looking to become more concise, more clear, you can do the haiku exercise with any information you're looking to convey to other people. And then if nothing else, we can use language, using linguistical cues. Like if you only take one thing away from everything I've just said, let it be blank. Or in this next drill, I want your singular focus to be on blank. We can always use language to prime attention and to focus their attention as well. The next challenge, chat-based. And again, we think texting. Gen Z is accustomed to chat-based forms of communication, so short exchanges of information and communication. Our challenge is, how do we operate in their conversational comfort zone while also starting to be intentional about expanding that zone in both written and verbal communications? A few ways that we can do this. And again, I'll pull these up here and just touch on a few. All right. So using technology, again, any sports program specifically that I've been a part of uses some form of group texting. I'm going to invite you in whatever platform you use, even if it's, Slack or GroupMe or whatever it happens to be, keeping those communications mostly about logistics. So if it's in a sports context, the bus leaves at this time, or practice has changed to this time, or please make sure you bring this. Anytime a student engages us in a text conversation and you recognize it's an important conversation to have, I'm going to ask that you invite them to take it into a different space. The reason being, we lose so much valuable information when we only have dialogue over text. And even though we have emojis and bitmojis and GIFs or GIFs, however you like to pronounce that, we still lose facial expressions. We lose tone of voice. We lose information that can allow us to have a better conversation. Now, just because you invite doesn't mean that they're going to accept. And gosh, it drives coaches crazy, I know, when they text us and we call them and then they don't pick up. So just because we invite doesn't mean that they won't, or doesn't mean that they will accept. However, if we don't invite, they will very happily continue to have conversations, even important ones, on a text-only basis. So can we create opportunities for them to start to practice? And can we give them choices? Can we say, hey, it sounds like this is important to talk about. Can I give you a quick phone call? Or do you want to FaceTime? Or can we schedule a Zoom? Or can you come by the office or by practice a little earlier, stay a little later? Finding opportunities to invite them to practice some of the skills that we know that they would benefit from having reps in. Whenever I have student meetings, I always give them choices. I say, okay, would you prefer a phone call, FaceTime, or Zoom? Of those three choices, phone call, FaceTime, Zoom, which one do you think is the most frequently chosen by Gen Z? Put it in the chat, whatever your guess happens to be. Phone call, FaceTime, Zoom. Okay, I see FaceTime, I see FaceTime, I see FaceTime. If you said FaceTime, you are correct. And that was shocking for me at first because I thought, gosh, a phone call would be a lot easier. Then, it doesn't matter where they are or what they're wearing. I've also learned they don't really care where they are or what they're wearing. I've had student conversations where they're clearly reclined in their bed or somewhere very comfortable and have not physically prepared for what would be maybe a professional appearance in a meeting. FaceTime is their comfort zone, in part because it mirrors what they so readily consume in social media. They're used to that form of communication, even if they're passively engaged in it, which is why it tends to be a preference for them. 5-minute meetings. Many of today's young people are individuals who would self-describe or who we might describe as socially anxious. We had an opportunity, I'm a co-host of a podcast called the Coaching Culture Podcast. We had an opportunity to interview the lead researcher for the book, The Anxious Generation, and a lot of this was reaffirmed during that time. Because we have a lot of anxiety prevalent among our young people, one of the ways to start to give them access and opportunity to practice skills that they may feel anxious about is to have 5-minute meetings. The beauty of 5-minute meetings is they're only 5 minutes. So even if a person feels uncomfortable, greatly so, about entering that space, it's not going to last very long. And what we find is in small doses, that repetition creates a space where they feel a little more confident and a little more skilled and capable. And those 5-minute conversations often lead to longer conversations. It's only 5 minutes. It's only with coach. This feels doable. Physical positioning. When I do this workshop live, the example I give is I'll invite an individual in the audience to bring their chair and come up to the stage, and I'll have another chair there. And what I'll do is I'll just use my hands. I'll take the two chairs and I'll put them across from each other. And in the context of sport, this often very much mirrors what we see in a coach's office. So the coach is sitting in a chair, there's a desk in the middle, and then the athlete is sitting on the other side. The first invitation for everyone, and this isn't just with Gen Z, if you're looking to have a more connective conversation, seek to remove any physical barriers between yourself and another person. Once we've got that physical barrier removed, I'm now sitting across from a stranger, often on a stage, and I'll ask them the question, how does this feel? For most people, this feels very uncomfortable. And the reality is the way our chairs are facing each other, this is a confrontational structure, even though it's not meant to be. We are quite literally squared off in our shoulders. We are head to head, and there's this felt need to maintain eye contact. What I'll then do is I'll ask them to shift their chair just 45 degrees so that now our chairs are facing slightly outward. we still have great avenues for eye contact. I'll ask them how they feel, and most people report this feels a little better in some way, like it doesn't feel as forced or stressful. So even just shifting our physical positioning slightly can change the way the conversation feels. Additionally, I always encourage coaches to have at least 2 chairs on the other side of their desk. So removing that physical barrier, coming alongside someone to have a more connected conversation. If you've got an individual who feels very challenged to communicate face to face, again, this isn't about lowering the standards or expectations. This is about meeting them where they are and helping them get reps to move more towards a space where they feel skilled and confident. So if that's true for an individual, a walk and talk is a great way to have a conversation, but it allows both people to do something, walking in moments of silence. We've got avenues for eye contact when we choose to turn and look at each other, but there's not that felt need to maintain it in a socially appropriate way, given the culture and context that we live in. So there's a variety of ways that just changing our physical positioning in relation to a young person can help facilitate opportunities for them to practice more of that face-to-face dialogue. And then the last thing I'll say here, the letter of recommendation. When I was coaching basketball, one of the activities we invited our freshmen to do before they stepped on campus is we asked them to write a letter of recommendation as if they were a member of the coaching staff. So what is it that you want us to say to your future potential employer about you by the time you leave our program? So what they're doing is they're putting in writing, in their own words, who they aspire to be and who they want to be. And we can take that letter and keep it with us. And at any time during their journey with us, we can bring that letter out as a way to check in. And we can say, hey, when you first got here, you said it was really important for you to be whatever was in that letter. And yet what we're seeing recently in terms of behavior doesn't align with that. So tell me what's changed. So it can be a great reference during your time with them to help them grow into the person that they want to be, but also an accountability check of sorts, because they've said it instead of us telling them, as part of this program, you need to be blank, blank, blank. There's a lot of power, especially when it comes to accountability and ownership, of having them participate in the creation of those expectations. All right, moving into co-create. This is a big one. So Gen Z is highly educated, industrious, and collaborative. It's very common practice, I'll say, for members of Gen Z to have an individual that they feel intimately or closely connected to, that they've never met in person and will never meet in person. Very not typical for previous generations. If you didn't meet someone in person, if you didn't actually know them or interact with them frequently in a physical space, it's unlikely you're going to share that close connection. So our challenge is, how do we find opportunities within their sport experience or their educational experience to co-create that experience with them? Because of technology, Gen Z has been able to customize so many elements of their world. That same desire, although often unexpressed, comes into their experience within sport or within college in general. So how do we co-create? Again, these are going to be athletic examples, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are so many different ways that we can invite young people to participate in their experience. Where the tipping point lies, and I'll say the pre-work, if you will, for co-creation is for you as an individual to first get really clear about what are my negotiables and my non-negotiables. What will I continue to be uniquely in control of or the facilitator of? And then what can I invite the athletes to weigh in on or to co-create with me? What you see on the screen are a few examples of how coaches specifically can co-create, inviting the athletes to give input. So every team I've ever worked with, every organization has some sort of rules or standards or expectations that guide how they operate in shared space. So inviting them to co-create that with you. Sometimes coaches will come up with the rules and they'll invite the athletes to come up with fair and appropriate consequences. Sometimes they'll flip that. This is the starting point for a conversation. You can always refine based on the responses that they give. It's the invitation that's truly the secret sauce or the magic in this equation. Again, meeting schedule, optional versus mandatory. The athlete's practice isn't the out of our allowable hours practices that coaches can't go to that's optional, but we really stress that it's a good idea, so it's kind of mandatory. This is, can you invite the athletes to do what you do as coaches? Can you have them for one practice, let's say, come up with the practice plan? How are we going to spend our time together? What are we going to focus on? Within a certain drill, what materials do we need? How are you going to set it up? How long is it going to take? What's the goal or purpose? What skills need to be executed? Having them do this activity, even if it isn't for an entire practice, or if you're an educator for an entire lesson plan, gives them insight into what you do as coaches or educators every day. It creates this shared understanding, which facilitates a lot of ease in places where there's often friction because they don't have the same experience that we have with what we do. When it comes to, I'll say, pre-competition goals, this was, again, a favorite activity that I did with the head coach I worked with for many years, Heidi Vanderveer. She's still the head coach at UC San Diego. On game day, we would come down to the locker room, Heidi and I, before our athletes arrived. And on the whiteboard, we would write 3 offensive keys, 3 defensive keys. Not the actual keys, just the words, 3 offensive keys, 3 defensive keys. And then as the athletes trickled in, they knew they were responsible as a group for writing what are the 3 things we need to do offensively and defensively to give ourselves the greatest opportunity for success in that game. And then when we came in as a staff to do the pregame talk, those were the first 6 things we addressed. If we've done our job as coaches, they are arguably putting on that whiteboard exactly what we would have written. But because we invited them to do it, now they have greater accountability, greater ownership, greater agency. So this is one example of how co-creation gets us more of what we say we want, what we know is valuable in a team context, but it involves giving up a little bit of maybe what we're used to doing and inviting our athletes to step into that space. All right, data-driven. So Gen Z sifts to find the most relevant data. Our challenge is to make things immediately relevant by leading with the why. This is huge. Again, they have access to information. So if we don't lead with the why, they're going to be wondering as they listen to us, okay, but what's the purpose? What's the value? How does this apply to me? So a few ways that we can do this. Again, leading with the why. In parentheses, it says for the sake of what? In my role as an executive coach working with people, this is my accountability question. Before I give an individual anything that I want them to do or spend their time on outside of our session time, I first need to answer for the sake of what? What is the value that they can get or expect to attain from spending their time in that way? Supporting with stats, again, this is related to the data. So whether it's key performance indicators, percentages, metrics relative to a certain sport or a certain skill, do we have that data? Again, I'm gonna pull up a couple bullet points extra here. So, with those top 2, leading with the why and then supporting with data. An example I want to give, because it's not just articulating the why and giving the data, how we do it matters. If, let's say, my team played on Saturday and we lost, we got out rebounded. Sunday's an off day. Monday we come in for practice, and after we get warmed up, we're going to start with a rebounding drill because we got out rebounded and we lost. I have 2 choices in how I present this information. Option A, I can say to my team, hey, tough loss Saturday. I know that wasn't the result we're looking for. We watched the game film, we looked at the season stats, and what we realized is every time we get out rebounded, we tend to lose. And so we're going to work on rebounding today to make sure that's a stronger area for us moving forward. Okay, so that's option A. Option B, I can come in and say, hey, tough game Saturday. I know that wasn't the outcome we're looking for. We looked at the game film, we looked at the season stats, and what we realized is every time we out rebound our opponents, we tend to be successful. So we're going to work on rebounding today to make sure that's a stronger element of our game moving forward. Very similar presentations. The key difference is every time we get out rebounded, we tend to lose. In the sport of basketball, a rebound is arguably a naturally occurring part of the game. If the ball doesn't go through the basket, somebody is going to get the rebound. If I've presented it from a fear state, every time we get out rebounded, we lose. Whenever we're in our next competition and the other team happens to get a rebound, which is going to happen, now my team is thinking, oh no, it's happening again, like we're one closer to losing. Versus if I've presented the information as every time we out rebound our opponent, we tend to be successful. Now with every rebound my team gets, even if the ball falls right to someone, now my team's thinking, oh sweet, we're one closer to winning. So not just what, but how we present the information matters. We know that a fear state is not a flow state. High performance doesn't happen when we're in a state of fear. And so as we deliver the data, as we use the data to support the why, the purpose, the value, as we use the data to engage with young people, we also need to be intentional and conscious about how the impact or the way that we're delivering that message through language is impacting them long term. Again, I'm going to just dip through the last few of these in the interest of time. When it comes to feedback, and I know this can be a challenging conversation, not just for coaches and educators to have with young people, but for them to have among themselves as peers. Gen Z values honest, immediate feedback. And if you're thinking, no, Betsy, they do not. I did that the other day and it wasn't well received. The asterisk at the bottom is some of the nuances that studies have shown to be true for today's young people. So it says, while being calm, caring, and encouraging. There was a study done at Georgia Southern University on the preferred coaching style of Gen Z athletes, and 4 themes emerged from that research. Number 1, they prefer a coach that does not yell and remains calm, is caring and encouraging, has knowledge of the sport, and involves the team in decision making. Now, that involving team in decision making, that's what we just talked about in terms of co-creation. Knowledge of the sport, most coaches have been hired for their position because they know something relative to that sport. Caring and encouraging, I've yet to meet a coach that's like, you know what, Betsy, I hate young people, can't stand them, really not interested in their growth and development. So that leads us back to number 1. And there's a difference here. Again, context matters. There's a difference in yelling because, let's say I coach an outdoor sport or I'm in a really loud environment, versus yelling for the purpose of shame, blame, degradation, embarrassment. Even when, and I'll say, Gen Z, the oldest of which is now almost 30-ish, I was working with the Las Vegas Raiders, and there's a young man who's a wide receiver for them. He's getting paid $30 million over 3 years to catch a football. He was 27. And my point of contact that I was touring the facility with my first time there said, hey, Betsy's going to be working with our coaches tomorrow. What advice would you have for coaches on how to best coach a guy like you? And this guy, 27, being paid $30 million, his exact words were, don't yell at me, talk to me. I'm not going to listen to the loudest guy in the room. I'm going to listen to the guy that talks to me like he has something he wants to teach me, like I'm somebody that he respects. And this is the thing, like the yelling part of coaching, us again, specifically in the context of the purpose for breaking down, is largely ineffective in a very different way than it used to be. So when it comes to feedback, a few things that I want to touch on here. Okay, so criticize, connect. And I find myself saying this in a lot of contexts. 2 things. Before you criticize, connect. Gen Z specifically is largely uninterested in your feedback until they first know unequivocally that you have their back. So have you taken the time to create a connection with a young person to the point that they know you have their best interest at heart? And then when you criticize, connect. When you offer some form of feedback, can you be intentional about connecting it to something you know that individual is in pursuit of? So if I know I've got a basketball player that wants to be the best ball handler in the conference, and I see her do a move, a crossover, let's say it's good, but I know it can be better. Instead of just telling her the ways in which I think it can be better, I'm going to preface that conversation with saying, hey, that was a good move. And because you said you want to be the best ball handler in our conference, I'm going to give you some feedback that otherwise might feel a little critical. It was a good move. And I think if you get a little lower in your transition, change the angle of your foot as you step by your defender, you're going to give yourself more space for that mid-range jumper I know you like so much. And this works with anybody, not just Gen Z, but can we give them the feedback and be intentional about connecting it to something that we know is of importance or a value or a goal that that person has? When it comes to feedback and framing our feedback, if you go to YouTube and type in Betsy Butterick, there's going to be 40 active videos that come up. ACT stands for Active Communication Technique. These are short videos, 3 minutes or less, designed to give anybody something they can do today to impact the way that we communicate and connect with each other. Act 24 is called Framing Your Ask, and that's going to give you a framework for asking for what you want in the context of what somebody else values. And when you do this, you increase the likelihood that they'll say yes, because saying no based on the way that you framed it also means that they're going to be saying no to something that they value and hold important. So if that's of any interest, go ahead and check out Act 24. I'll skip to the bottom here, truth plus action. For today's young people, they often say, Coach, just tell me the truth, or I just want you to just tell me what's true. And often what they make the truth mean can be the challenging part, or their resistance to accepting the feedback that we have to offer. One of the more effective formulas I've found for today's young people is, can we tell them the truth, but can we not stop there? Can we tell them the truth about a reality or situation, and in a very short proximity, give them some action they can choose to take that's controllable by them to change or alter that truth if they choose to do so. Oftentimes we tell them the truth. Basketball context, kid turns it over 3 times, and I hear a coach say, you can't keep turning it over. And the kid's like, yeah, no kidding. This isn't great for me either. Can we tell them the truth and then give them an action? You can't keep turning it over. Or skip that part and just say, hey, next time down the floor, change the angle of your body to protect the ball. Make sure you pass with your outside hand. They want to do well. And what I hear from student athletes specifically and constantly is coach names the mistake, but they don't tell me how to fix it, or they don't tell me how to get better. They're just doubling down on what I did wrong. The last two, and again, I apologize for rushing here, but I want to make sure that I cover everything that we can. Extrinsically motivated. So again, in large part due to social media, young people today have become disproportionately focused on obtaining peer validation. So how do we help young people start to work towards intrinsic motivation or intrinsic value? How do we separate their worth inherently from the opinions of other people? A few ways that we can do this. And again, I'll pull them up here. Okay, validating when successful. Across the board, this is largely a common practice for most people. A kid does something that we know is good or a good part of the process, and we name that thing. We congratulate them for it in some way. Can we acknowledge their effort in terms of support? Now, I remember I was watching a water polo practice once, and there was a phrase a coach used that I loved. And that phrase was, "It looks like you're making the right mistakes." And what I loved about that phrase was the juxtaposition the language placed on right and mistakes. Because for many young people, mistakes are not good. So if it's right that I'm making mistakes, that brings into question my relationship with failure or with frustration or challenge. And then when it comes to challenge, we have to make it safe to fail. If you're already not well-versed, I'll say, or aware of what psychological safety is, of what it looks like in our sport environments, in our classroom environments, how we can be intentional about creating it. And by and large, many people in your chosen profession or field have a higher awareness than others. But this is one of the things that's crucially important for young people, especially when we talk about mental health and well-being. We have to make it safe to fail, in part because this generation has a very difficult time separating out, I've experienced a failure, from I am a failure. For them, these are often intricately linked. So how do we start to reshape their experience of failure and what it means in service of them retaining their value and worth as a person, separate from the ups and downs that naturally come from sport, from school, from life? Peer evaluations, if I had to add an asterisk here, I would say peer evaluations can be a fantastic exercise for perspective, growth, and understanding, if and only if the team or group culture is in a really healthy place. If those elements of psychological safety are fully present. If they're not, it can be a fairly traumatic exercise, and it's not that you shouldn't do it, but if you're going to do it, you should be prepared on how to support individuals that feel in some way traumatized by how they've been judged by their peers. Peer acknowledgement or recognition, that is good at any time. So being intentional about creating spaces for young people to recognize and to vocalize and verbalize what they see and appreciate in others. And then the last one, instant gratification. Again, because of technology, Gen Z is used to getting what they want now. If they could have gotten it sooner, that would have been better. But if now is as soon as they can get it, that's what they'll take. So how do we help them work towards delayed gratification? How do we help them work towards outcomes over time while keeping them engaged and informed? A few things that we can do. All right, so now and later, kind of like the classic candy of old that your dentist was like, never have this candy. When they start to work on this, it's going to be hard and sticky, but the longer they work at it, the softer, the more palatable it's going to become. And I've always appreciated that question, what will your future self thank you for? Can we be intentional about helping young people identify what can they do today, right now, something that they have control over, that they have access to, that's going to set them up in some way for a slightly better tomorrow, or it's going to move them incrementally closer to what they want to have right now, but they can't have right now because of a function of time or process. Can we be intentional about giving them feedback, about measuring progress towards goals? Controllables and uncontrollables. I'm going to tell a brief story that might take us just over time, but I feel it's important because it relates to mental health and well-being for today's young people. There's a guy named Charlie Jones. He's in the NFL Hall of Fame, but not as a broadcaster, or not as a football player. Charlie was a broadcaster. And the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia were Charlie's third Olympic Games. So he's a super seasoned broadcaster, very excited for the assignments to come out. The assignments come out, and Charlie was assigned to rowing, kayaking, and canoeing, which especially in 96, not many people watched. He was bummed, but as a professional, he knew he needed to get to work, and work for Charlie meant doing the athlete interviews. And he'd ask them questions like, how does your lane assignment affect your race strategy? Or what do you do if the winds shift mid-race? And what he found is regardless of the country of origin of the athlete he was speaking with, they all had the same response. And that response was, that's outside my boat. And he realized that this population of athletes had gotten so specific about what they were willing to spend their time and energy and effort on and what was outside of their control. And Charlie went on to write a book called That's Outside My Boat. And I tell that story because I know in the work that you all do, in the work that we do as coaches and educators, sometimes that asterisk that says other duties as assigned can feel like we need to also be a mental health professional or a crisis intervention person or a sports psychologist or a pseudo parent. And without any of those relevant certifications, something any of us can do at any time in support of young people is help them identify something within their control. Because what we've noticed with young people who find themselves experiencing some sort of crisis of mental health is they're often disproportionately focused on elements outside of their control. And while we may not be able to change those things, through conversation with the intention of care and support, we can help them identify something small that they can do that perhaps gives them a greater sense of stability or creates a little more space or ease within whatever they happen to be experiencing. And then when I say diversity here, what I mean is how diverse can we be in terms of what we do and how we do it? So many coaches specifically teach the way they were taught, or they do the same drill every year because it's foundational skill for their sport in the same way. Can we be intentional about looking into other avenues, opportunities, arenas to learn more about how we can diversify the way that we teach and educate, not only to increase engagement, but also for our own growth and development as well? So I apologize for going a little over time. I do want to put my contact information up here. The first QR code that you see on the top on the right-hand side, if you have feedback about today's session, I would love to hear it. If there were things that were not covered or that you'd like to see me be more intentional about, my work is largely driven by people like yourself and the feedback that I get. So if that's of interest to you, I welcome your feedback, and the first QR code is for you. The bottom QR code, if you're interested in additional resources, either about Gen Z or about communication in general, please check that out and you'll find some provided for you. While I don't have time to take questions right now and I want you to get back to your meeting agenda, my information is here on the screen. So if there's a question that you have, please shoot me an email. I would love to respond to that in real time. And just again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share space with you all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Betsy. We really appreciate you and all of the great information that you just shared with us. This was awesome. Understanding that we are rounding out and at our ending time, just want to share a couple small things from the Office of Inclusion really quickly. All right, so the MOIC Champions of Diversity and Inclusion recognition is open now. We are now accepting nominations until January 13th. So one of the things that is distinctly different about this award in comparison to the NCAA and MOA Award for Diversity and Inclusion, the NCAA MOA Award for Diversity and Inclusion recognizes institutions and conference offices, and the MOIC Champions of Diversity and Inclusion recognizes individuals. So if you know some folks that are really championing this work within athletics, we encourage you to nominate them, and self-nominations are also welcome. And also, if you will be at NCAA convention in January in Nashville, please come check us out. On Wednesday, January 15th, we will be pretty busy as an office.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Wilson. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the managing director in the Office of Inclusion. Sade is in the national office, and she's having some trouble with her internet. So I just want to thank you all for being with us today. Know that you'll be getting more emails from us about upcoming, educational opportunities and professional development for ADIDs. We are in this with you and want to be supportive. And as Sade noted, we will also be sending out specific information about our new e-modules, and we look forward to being with you. Betsy, thank you. You did a great job for us today. We always love it when you're in our space. And I'll just end by saying, continue to practice self-care, take care of yourselves, and reach out to the Office of Inclusion in any ways that we can help you. We're all in this together. So thanks, everyone, and take care. We'll see you soon.